The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning and welcome. This is Craig Spiesel from the Online Trust Alliance, and thank you for joining us today for the 2017 Online Trust Audit Methodology Overview. Also with me today is Jeff Wilbur, VP of Research from OTA, and we'll be sharing insights into the methodology. For background, this is the 9th annual audit that we have conducted, and last September, as in every year, we have an open call for public comments on the methodology and the criteria as the threat landscape is changing, as privacy policies and norms are changing. So we're continually evolving that. So again, in September, we had the open call for comments, and then last month, we actually released the criteria and principles that we will be monitoring and auditing against. Today's webinar is actually to walk through a little more detail and to provide attendees more information on how we do this, why we do this, and more importantly, how to maximize your score as a site and adopt what we consider sound security practices and responsible privacy principles. So as noted, again, you'll see many areas that are evolving, as well as points for bonus points and core points. But a lot of people ask, why do we do this? It's a substantial effort, one of the primary initiatives that OTA does every year. But we feel it's very important to move the industry from a compliance mindset to stewardship, one of really doing the right things. And also one of the key parts is we want to recognize companies that are doing the right thing. And so by that, we list organizations that make the honor roll. We also recognize those that make the top 5%. So it's really important for that leadership to be recognized in the commitment they're making. And ultimately, we think that is an incentive to enhance these practices. And we know today many major corporations come to us and have told us that our increasing awareness of these practices has helped shape their security practices. And ultimately, we want consumers to be aware of companies that really are towing the line in these areas. So I'm going to very quickly give a background of where we have been, and then Jeff will jump on and share where we are going. So historically, we've looked at close to 1,000 sites, and we divide the data, we segment and parse the data by segment in 3 buckets: security, consumer protection, and privacy. And in each category, there are there are 100 baseline points, and we have a weighted analysis of over 50 criteria. And in the past, if you scored an 80% or better of the core points, or as long as not a single category you were failing, you were named to the honor roll. So this is the baseline of where we've been. And you can see from this chart here that over the past 4 years, we actually have data going all the way back, we've seen a steady growth, which has been fantastic. But I should add, part of this growth has also been through of additional bonus points or emerging practices that companies have adopted. And if we were to normalize this data, we would see the achievement be much flatter or have a slight in growth year to year. So as I mentioned, we look at sectors, and it's really important. We want to recognize leadership. Consistent year to year, you have seen growth. So again, the criteria has evolved, but they're consistent between the Internet Retail 100. The second bar is the Internet Retail 500. The third grouping of bars is the FDIC, the top 100 banks. The third category is what we call consumer, which is really, think of it as websites that aren't banking and aren't e-commerce that require a login. And then we also have news and media. And you can see in certain categories we have not done it over year to year, but still we have positive growth in every areas. So the area, obviously, significant growth in the news category, but they still lag all sectors. And if we were to drill down on that data, the big factors there are privacy and the data sharing that occurs from news sites which rely on advertising and sharing data with third parties. So that gives you a little bit of a background where we are. I do want to share that this is a major initiative. It's taking tens of thousands of hours, I think. At least it feels that way. And we are requesting underwriters and donors, and certainly want to acknowledge those companies last year that stepped up to the plate. And again, thank you to Symantec, Acton, DigiCert, Distill Networks, SiteLock, and ThreatWave. So again, if you're interested, let us know here. So as I mentioned, it's about positive affirmation. We list those organizations that make it. We never share who fails. We never share the raw data, and we've actually refused to comply with threats of subpoena for our data. Again, our whole goal is to move the industry forward, and we rely on a lot of organizations to help us in this area. So last year, once again, Twitter ranked #1 across all sectors. And then if we look at the individual categories of the top 500 retailers, Gap took #1. Of the federal government sites, healthcare.gov was great, banking Iberiabank, and in the news and media segment, Google. So this gives you a little bit of an overall and foundation. And now I want to hand over to Jeff, who will share some of the major changes in 2017, and then we'll go through each one of these buckets and review the specifics. Jeff?
Thanks, Craig. Yeah, so this slide is pretty much what you saw for 2016, and in each of these we're going to dig into, as Craig said, consumer protection, security, and privacy, and we'll highlight with the red box and in italicized letters which things are changing from year to year. So it's very easy to tell what we're looking at. So this year we're keeping the sectors pretty much the same that Craig described that we've done historically, but we're adding one new category, and that is the top ISPs, carriers, mailbox providers. So this would be kind of the usual suspects that you might think of in that category, and we're putting that list together now and want to look at those practices for the first time. Some of them do exist in other categories already. For instance, some of the mailbox providers are in the consumer service bucket today. As far as scoring goes, we're keeping things pretty much the same, 100 baseline points in each of the 3 major categories. Similar criteria. You'll see the criteria changes as we walk through the specifics here. But a couple kind of high-level scoring changes we're considering are that the honor roll this year, instead of being 80% of the of 300 points that includes bonuses, we may do it that you have to do 80% of the baseline 300 points. As Craig mentioned, we've kind of had bonus point creep over the years, and as new practices come out, we assign them bonuses, and they eventually become part of the baseline, and then ultimately become penalties if you don't do them. And so we've found that we have a lot of bonus points available, and that we may just draw that honor roll line where you have to do it according to the baseline points available and not the bonuses. And then we're also looking at the failure line that we've used historically is 55%, like an F. We're thinking of moving that up to 60% or higher. We're doing that sensitivity analysis now and kind of looking at the weighting and seeing where we end up. But we expect that that will affect the number of sites that make the honor roll, but for good reason, because you really have to have those baseline best practices in place to assure that you're doing things right.
Yeah, and Jeff, if I can add, last year we started going down this path because we recognized there was a lot of companies making the honor roll, but there was also others, and we created this top of class category, which I believe scored 95% or better. So we last year kind of set the path of having 2 levels of achievement. So I think what you'll see there is if we go down to the 80% of base points for the honor roll, the bonus points would be what would move people into that other category. So
right
on that area. Great.
Good point. So I want to dig into the consumer protection area now. So just the color coding here for anyone who hasn't seen one of these before, the gray is the baseline points, the green is the bonuses, and the red is the penalty, and we'll follow that method as we go through this. So essentially the 100 baseline points in consumer protection are all about email authentication. using SPF and DKIM at the top level, and any subdomains using DMARC records on top of that. And for this year, you can see in the red boxes the changes that we're looking at are to increase the weight for SPF and DKIM at the top level domain. That would be your corporate or organizational domain, versus subdomains that might be used for other purposes. And to increase the weight for a reject policy in DMARC, meaning that you're telling recipients of your email that if it fails authentication, to not deliver that message. And so this helps protect consumers more. The bonus points stay the same. The categories, it's TLS, which encrypts messages between servers, DNSSEC, and IPv6. And then you get penalty points if you do not lock your domain. And so that's been the same for the last several years. The red box down at the bottom there is we are assessing DMARC records slightly differently. You can put out a DMARC record that says no policy, and it essentially is a useless DMARC record if you don't get reports back on how your authentication is performing. And so we're requiring this year that to get credit for a DMARC record, you must be delivering reports to somewhere so that you can see how your authentication is doing. Just a quick email authentication primer. There are two standards out there that are used to authenticate email, SPF shown on the top left there and DKIM on the top right. They do things slightly differently, but they both allow a recipient to verify that the sender is who they say they are. And they complement each other in terms of filling gaps in how they are used and how effective they are in different scenarios. DMARC is a technology and a standard that sits on top of that that allows the sender to, as I mentioned, get reports back on how their authentication is performing, so they can make sure that their authentication is good, and also see if someone is trying to pretend to be them out there. And it also allows them to assert a policy of what to do with failed messages. So that cocktail is very important to protect consumers. One of the primary ways we check on this is using a tool that's on the OTA site itself. And so here are some screenshots. You can see there that you can list as many as 500 domains in this box, and then you can check the for SPF records or DMARC records. So here's a listing of those sites, domains for their SPF records. You can see they all have them, and it actually lists the entire record out so you can look at the specifics. And then if you were to search for the DMARC records, on the next slide here, you can see who has a DMARC record. And in fact, you can look at OTA here and see that the policy, which is the end of that top line, P equals reject. So that's the reject policy that we were talking about that would score the highest. So if you want to score those 100 baseline points, you would have SPF and DKIM at your top level domain with a DMARC record with a reject policy. And you would maximize your score for those baseline points. So moving on to site security, again, color coding, as I mentioned before, italics show what's changed. The baseline points are a combination of assessment for your server and SSL implementation done by a variety of tools, which we'll look at in a minute. Bonuses if you use extended validation search. This is the one that turns your browser bar green so that you know what site you're on, and you've been vetted more as a business to be able to use that certification. You also get bonus points for always-on SSL. This year we're looking at ways to assess whether you are set up to mitigate DDoS attacks, and we're kind of working through that right now on how we'll assess that. And the other two areas that we've added this year for bonus points are whether you offer multi-factor authentication, so this protects the consumer and your site from abuse, and also a vulnerability reporting mechanism, which Craig will talk about in detail in a few minutes here. There are a variety of penalties you can get. It's generally for bad things that are seen on your site, like cross-site scripting, malware, malicious links, malvertising incidents that have happened where you've served up ads on your site that have malware in them. whether you have a bot risk. And then not everyone knows this, but there are actually 3 types of SSL certificates you can get. One is extended validation, which we already talked about as a bonus. There's one called organizational validation, where you do get some vetting of you as a business and who you are to get that certificate. And then there's one called domain validated certificates, DV. Those are easy to get. They're generally very cheap. There's very little checking on the business itself. And so we're actually assigning a penalty to those this year, which we did last year as well. So here's some of the tools that we use. These are publicly available. This one is from High Tech Bridge, one of our members. You can put in any domain and get a result back. It's a letter grade. We map that to a score. The left picture here shows the SSL server test. And that's OTA site. We get an A+. And we map those like you would kind of school grades from A through F. And then on the right side is some additional testing you can do of the security setup of that site. And these are the kind of tools we're using to feed the baseline points.
Yeah, Jeff, I Jeff, I'm sorry here. May want to point out that I encourage people to go through here. There's a lot of additional data and telemetry these tools provide and reports you can download. There's additional data that comes in here, and for example, that we use, and we run APIs, and so the data helps us a tremendous amount. But again, these are something that we encourage, and there's some other sites, tools that we also use, encourage you to be checking on a frequent monthly basis because things change, standards change, configurations change.
Yeah, absolutely. There are dozens of things that are looked at to come up with this summary grade on these sites, and so the protocols and the ciphers that you use and everything else, and as new vulnerabilities are discovered, they'll get factored into this grading. And these sites, and here's another example of SSL Labs, this is another one that we use, they will actually give you specifics on which protocols and ciphers and keys are weak or vulnerable, and so it can really point you in the right direction on how to remediate any issues that are going on. And then this is a new one this year. A new member joined called Security Scorecard. They offer a similar service to the others, but with a bunch of additional capability and views. And so they look at the risk profile of a site and its history over time, and then they look at it in a lot of different areas, and then they assign letter grades to those areas. So we'll be incorporating their data as well into both the baseline scoring as well as some of the bonus and penalty areas.
Yeah,
and their data.
I just add here, as you see here, in this case, the tool, you put in your domain name and it generates a report back to you, and so only you have visibility of the results here. And they look at a lot of different things, a little deeper in some other areas, complements in other areas that we're doing here. So again, we'll be running an API against their data, and again, integrating this into the mix for that security score.
And then finally, some of the bonus and penalty things that I talked about. There are a variety of tools we use there. The upper left is one of Security Scorecard looking at malware. SiteLock in the lower middle there does scanning for malware and malicious links and a number of other things. High Tech Bridge, as we already looked at some of their stuff, but they also look at some of that additional things. Then there's a new company called Hardenize, which is founded by someone who was at SSL Labs in Qualys and is doing similar services, actually going beyond those baselines. And they're kind of in the early stages now, but we may be using their data as well to do some assessment of some additional items.
Yeah, for example, Jeff, I can interject there. If you look at what Hardenize is doing, again, encourage you guys, again, that's a public tool. And the whole point here is these are public tools not only for us, but for yourself. But I can also tell you that this is tools that the criminals and those who want to create abuse and chaos can also assess. In the case of Hardenize, we've been working really close. So for example, DNSSEC that you see there on the far right, they're checking for that. So that's one of our other criterias. They look at valid SPF and DMARC policies as well. So we've been, like I said, partnering with them as well as the folks at Security Scorecard and others to get a more comprehensive view of these practices. So again, just want to reiterate the value of these tools for companies to assess, not only for our audit, but for ongoing.
Yeah, so just to emphasize that point, we'll be doing our auditing essentially during the month of April, or mid-April on in general. And if you wanted to take a look at your own site using these public tools today, you could do that. And if you see any gaps or vulnerabilities that exist today, you could be addressing those in the next month and a half or so before we actually do the audit in April.
And Jeff, and that actually is I'm glad you brought that up. That's why we're doing this. Our goal is we want everyone to make the top of the class. We want everyone to make the honor roll. And as part of our commitment is not only talking about these best practices, is trying to point people in that direction and to those tools. So that's, again, from the release of the methodology last month, there'll be roughly close to 90 days that organizations will have an opportunity to optimize their practices as well as some of the privacy policy efforts that we'll touch on in a minute.
So one last point, I made the point about different types of certificates. These are the results we saw last year out of the roughly 1,000 sites that Craig mentioned. So about 31% had the extended validation, so they received bonus points. It's mainly banks and retailers and some of the consumer sites. The bulk are kind of in the middle in that organizationally validated certs. That's kind of neutral scoring, and then the DV certs are the ones that receive a penalty, as I mentioned. That's about 18% of what we saw last year.
Well, great. Thanks for that overview, Jeff. I want to touch really quickly on vulnerability reporting, and this is an issue that OTA started to experience a few years ago. When we went through that security audit, all the things that Jeff was sharing, we would find sites that had significant vulnerabilities, and we tried to reach out to companies. And I will tell you that our success was ineffective at best. We had either no response or threatening response that you're not authorized to look at our site. And all we were trying to do is trying to help these companies. We're trying to contact them and saying, there's malware on your site. We see malicious links. And in effect, we were trying to get the organizations to fix them, and we actually went a step further and say, if you can fix this within the next 10 days, we'll rescore you. This is like, the professor trying to tell you what you need to do to fix your work. So we found it was very challenging and ineffective. And we weren't alone in this effort. And that kind of led over a year ago for the Department of Commerce to stand up a working group on how to address vulnerabilities and what is responsible disclosures or coordinated vulnerability disclosures. So encourage everyone to go through this. There are some very good resources here. And we've, as a result of our challenges and as a result of now widely accepted practices of what companies should be doing, we've integrated this into the honor roll. So there's lots of resources. This deck and this presentation will be available later today on our site. But effectively, every site needs to have a vehicle for responsible reporting of bugs or vulnerabilities. So how do you do this? And one of the challenges is we sometimes find that there's a reporting mechanism, but if you weren't in the club, or if you didn't know where to look for it or search for it, you couldn't find it. So right now, for sites to get maximum scoring, we're expecting to have a discoverable link on the homepage of the site. Not unlike company information or privacy policy or terms of use, you should have a link for example, bug reporting or security vulnerability. So that's the maximum scoring. We will give additional, or we'll give some points if we can find it within the site search function. If your site doesn't have a site search, then we won't search for it on there. Again, we're looking at what is the responsible and easy way, and the earlier graphic, how do you put that welcome mat out? So we're working with NTIA right now on coming up a set of key search words that we will index against and on this area. This is really important, again, because think about crowdsourcing vulnerabilities. This is a great way to get people to report to you. It's also very important that you demonstrate that you want this information, because what we see all too often is researchers get frustrated, and what ends up happening is they end up going and making public disclosures. That's the last thing we want for anyone. So again, the whole idea is maximize your security and ultimately maximize your reputation of your site. So again, lots of resources. I should note, bug bounty is just a tactic to support this. We're not advocating that. For some companies, perhaps in the software industry, that makes a lot of sense. But in general, I don't think a bug bounty program is necessarily for the general website, though you may want to offer that. So lots of resources in that area. Let's jump to the third pillar, privacy. Some changes, excuse me, I have this cough. Some changes as in the other pillars. Again, date stamp on top of page. That may sound very trivial, but again, consistency, and it's really important, and discoverability. Hidden on the bottom of 30 screens down isn't very effective. That's a simple thing to change someone can do. So we look at the privacy policy, or I should say privacy category, in two categories. How well constructed and how much transparency and notice do you have on your privacy policy? So do you define what data you share? Do you define what's retained? And third-party sharing. Do you have a do not track disclosure? So these things are what I would say the foundation of a good privacy policy. Now, people will come back and argue that they have a certification from a third party. A certification just as effectively is only stating that you're doing what you say you do. They're not requiring some of these other efforts. And again, we're talking about stewardship here, not compliance. So date stamping was another one. The other one is cross-device tracking disclosures. We've debated if that should be part of the base points, but right now it's a bonus. The FTC has been pretty clear that sites need to disclose that. And I think we have some support from some of the trade groups in that area as well. So those are some big areas there. But let me walk through some of the examples. But before I talk on that, you'll see honor and do not track we'll touch on, multilingual policies. A lot of people question that. Our site is on English. Why should we do it in another language? And our feeling is that a privacy policy deals with a lot of complex issues that are best suited to be in someone's primary language, while they may still read English and everything else, and we see that as bonus points as well. Tag management solutions, managing tags is very important, and as you note in the base point, 50% of the score is based on how much tracking activity is occurring on your site. And what we're looking at is tracking with third parties and sharing data. We're not degrading a score if you have analytics that are anonymous only for site metrics or fraud detection purposes. We're talking about the trackers that really are cross-device tracking, the ones that are retargeting and such, and sharing data with third parties. And then we also have penalty points. If your who is private, means your people can't really find out who you are, who your website's registered to. If you have multiple data breach incidents, and if you've had FTC settlements or state settlements within the past 2 years. So combined, that provides a score. But let me walk through some of the examples of privacy policies. So this is OTA's privacy policy on our site, and I'm going to walk through what we've done to try to walk the talk here. And as you know, just like in the security area and all the other elements, we've adopted best practices. We've adopted DNSSEC. We have a reject policy on DMARC. We believe it's very important. So first of all, we have our date stamp on the top of the page. Very clear And we also have a note there, see archive privacy policies. So you have the ability to go and see what's changed. And the reason we think this is really important, it's great that you show a site on your site that you've made a change, but what does that tell the user? So there's lots of ways of doing that. In our case, we redline and cross out. There's other changes on here. There's other approaches that one could take. You could bold it out. So we think that's a very simple thing to do, and there's different ways of implementing that. For example, Google goes back to their very first privacy policy, and they list that, and they also list a comparison what has changed. So we think in the spirit of transparency and providing users clarity, this is a really good way of handling it. Microsoft has a similar one. They go through, they don't redline it, but they put in very concise, digestible sentences of what has changed. Again, these are other good examples of pointing to archive versions of previous privacy policies. We also think having the short form with a layered policy is very good, and there's multiple ways of doing this. So in a sense here, what we're looking at OTAs, and we have what's a short form here. And if we were to click on the link, we'd actually get an expanded view. So you're seeing each one of the categories learn more. So this has been written with the goal to be more intuitive and concise. And again, if you want the full policy, you can click in within each section or at the top of the page. And again, this is an example of, it is on the long form here, and you can see all the way down, it's more information that talks about the areas here. So these are simple things to implement. We mentioned we also have our own site in Spanish, and again, in that case of trying to be open and as transparent as possible. Let me jump into cross-device tracking. We mentioned that, and we added this to this year's methodology for a few reasons. Well, first of all, I want to set the foundation. Cross-device tracking in the right context can provide consumers tremendous amount of benefit. It's not necessarily bad, and I think there's a great process to that. And I mentioned here, you have a seamless experience if you're on your phone, you go into your website, you go into your iPad, back and forth. It also has fraud detection and account security benefits. Sites can detect if you're coming from different devices, how one was the last time. So there's a lot of benefits there. And I think ultimately you can have an enhanced online experience. If a site has already showed you an ad on your mobile device, maybe it's not as appropriate to show you that same ad over and over. So there's lots of areas of improvement here, or I should say of positive elements here that we want to encourage. But what's been really come out of the FTC, Federal Trade Commission, is you need to tell consumers that you are doing this tracking. And so we'll be looking for this within your privacy policy. And what we're encouraging is be transparent. Provide consumers control over their data. Again, we need to have heightened protections, and again, maintain reasonable security of collected data. And these are the recommendations from the FTC, and I encourage you to look at them. We have resources at the end of the webinar for companies to look at in any of these areas. And I should note, I see a few questions that have come up. We'll take questions at the end. And happy to have a deeper conversations on any of these subjects here. So we'll be looking for, again, within your privacy policy, what are you stating on your policy in this area here? Do not track, as many of you know, has been evolving over the years. We give sites bonus points for core points, I believe, under if you have a disclosure. And then second, you get bonus points if you honor the implementation. So again, in this case, what you're looking here is OTA's website and how we've addressed this. Again, an important part of transparency, and it provides users control over their online experience. I do want to use a shout out. We mentioned one of the bonus points is icons and how sites can use that. Here's one of our members, Publishers Clearinghouse, and their most recent release of their privacy policy from November. And they've kind of combined several of the criteria that we recommend. They have this short layered approach here. Again, learn more. And it's interesting, when they first did this, their long policy was over about 4,500 words, and I think they took this down to less than 500 words in all the areas combined. So a great example of being more transparent, provide notice and control. And then again, they provide users, the ability to click through. They've also come up with icons, which are important. We don't discriminate on types of icons. Everyone has their own flavor right now. We do wish there was some consistency, but nevertheless, we do think this is important. And again, kudos to them and others who have adopted such a concise approach. So I do want to talk a little bit of the area that is somewhat harder for some companies to get their hands around, is the amount of trackers. As I mentioned, of the 100 baseline points a site gets scored on for privacy, half of it is the privacy policy, how well it's constructed and does it address the core areas we outlined. The other side is how much tracking that's going on of the site. And again, a site starts out with 50, and the more trackers a site has, the more points they lose from that. And again, we're only looking at the third-party calls and site tracking. We aren't looking at anonymous site metrics, and we really want to focus on those trackers that are known in their policy is sharing and retargeting. And again, when you read their policies, and it's kind of this domino effect, a daisy chain occurs. Now, we do get in a lot of people say, well, they support the ad choices model from the Digital Advertising Alliance. And we respect that, and that's great. But ad choices is really about serving interest-based advertising. And there is not the prohibited, sites aren't prohibited of sharing and using data for other purposes. So currently that is the model. So while that's great for interest-based advertising, this is really about privacy and it's data tracking. So how do we do this? That's a challenge. And so we have our own tools that we've developed. We cross sites, and there's several companies out there that we've worked with, some of our members, companies such as Disconnect, Insighten, which looks at tag management systems. Trusty does a great amount of work. And also we've looked at Ghostery as well. So there's multiple tools. I encourage you to use those. The biggest challenge that we find is these tags there's remnants. They are left over, and there's not a good process that companies have of managing them. And so that really underscores this. And I think last year we found an average of 10 or 8 or 10 trackers on a site, but the highest one site was over 130 trackers. And this site was sharing data very excessively. And that's what we're concerned about. Again, this is not something that the typical consumer would have visibility, though you could run Ghostery or you could run Disconnect and you could see those sites there. Jeff, did you have anything you want to add to any of these on the privacy side before we move forward?
No, I think you summarized it pretty well.
Great. And again, I see a few comments coming in here. The challenge is in this area is how do you manage this process? And is this an IT issue? Is this a marketing issue? Or is it a web operation issue? And who controls that? And this is an area where it's harder for organizations to combine and collaborate, but it's also an area of opportunity. The one area we come back to and they say, well, we don't do that. Our privacy policy is we don't do that. And we say, well, we know this third-party tracker does that, so we have a disconnect there, and no pun intended, between the company Disconnect. So that is an area, and again, it requires that diligence. And so my counsel here is to do an audit and analysis and to validate the business purpose of those trackers, whether they're collecting or sharing data with third parties or not. What I would highly suspect is you'll see a great number of them that you're not able to validate the business reason. There may have been an agreement with an organization that you're no longer partnering with, but they're still tracking on your site. So encourage you to address this as soon as possible. So we have
Craig,
a lot.
just to
Go
make
ahead.
to make the point, earlier we talked about bonuses for tag management or privacy solutions. That's exactly what those are meant to address, is being able to see and manage the trackers that are on your site for just that reason, so you can evaluate what's there, what's it doing, and evaluate the business purpose of it.
Yeah, that's really core. And so you'll see that a lot of the bonus points and the core points intersect, you might say. And again, there are companies that out there, we don't, I think there's about 8 or so companies in the industry that provide tag management or privacy tracking solutions, you know, that are out there. Trustee and Citon, I believe Adobe has some. So they're really something we encourage sites to consider there. So we have some resources I'm going to touch on here, and then we'll take some of the questions. So again, you can sign up for here. This deck and all the materials will be posted on our site under the redirect of Trust Audit. We love that. If you want to get more involved, you can join. We'd love to have you consider that. But specific to a lot of the resources we talked about, we have several resources and tools for email authentication, always on SSL or HTTPS everywhere. Clearly have some guidance on that area. SSL best practices, EV SSL, again, out there. And then this is a summary of the resources that we're using to help validate and come up with that composite scoring for a site security here. And I do want to mention that Hardenized is in an alpha mode there, but it gives some good telemetry, and we're working with them to see how far they progress in the next 60 days before we initiate the kickoff of our actual auditing process. And the other one I wanted to share is the FTC with the vulnerability reporting. As I mentioned, the FTC initiated a response last week, published it on their review of this, and the NTIA process. So, so that's a summary here. So we have some time for questions. I encourage you to use the chat window, or ideally in the question pane, and we'll try to take through as many of these questions as possible. So, again, so some of the questions, the first question is really important, is when will the audit actually start? At the earliest that we are planning of running the data is 2 months from now. So basically, April 20th is the target date to start running the data analysis of sites. It takes several weeks for us to run it. We look at certain areas multiple times, we ping it. The privacy policy process is very difficult. It takes actually hand auditing, and so at 1,000 sites, you're talking that alone for a full-time person is a month of work of just auditing the privacy policies on the sites. So that's the process, and if we follow our existing cadence, then we actually release the report in mid-June. And throughout that process, we're recalibrating, and as Jeff mentioned, the final scoring and weighting is done at that time. And Jeff, do you want to touch on that a little bit, of how we kind of come to some of the scoring without the specifics, but in general?
Yeah, well, I mentioned kind of at a big picture that, you know, new practices come in as bonuses and then eventually roll into baseline and then eventually become penalties, and that's what we're articulating through this webinar and our just methodology in general. But then the specific weighting, we kind of look at the actual adoption rates, and if it's something that, for instance, you know, we say should be a bonus, but we find that 80% of people are already adopting it, we might change the weighting of that, and then that would also kind of drive us to make it part of the baseline for the next year if it's already gotten wide adoption. Or vice versa, we may find that something is articulated in the industry as a great new practice, but there's only 3% of sites that have adopted it so far. And so we kind of use the actual data to affect the weighting and the calibration as we go through. And so some of that is done late in the process so that we can have all the factors available to us to do that weighting.
Great. Well, again, it's that part of that process of really seeing where we are and rewarding that. The question is, if I'm failing, how do I get this information? How do I get the results of this? The data, we only provide the top level summary to, and that's posted in the annual report. The actual analysis and walking through that is something that is very time consuming. We do offer that for members, but again, if you're not a member, you have to kind of on your own, and that's just why we provide these tools and resources for you to do that. So again, the whole goal is to be vendor neutral and open here, but it is that is one of the benefits that for members we do provide a briefing and walk through every area, so to provide that additional counseling, so to speak. Another question that's come up here is a certificate site. If you can articulate the why, the concern on OV certificates. And I think, Jeff, you summed it up really quickly, but Jeff, maybe you can expand a little bit the concern of OV and how versus DV and the concern in those areas, and specifically the DV certificate, I think.
Right. So just as a reminder, EV is the one that gives you the green browser bar where there's a lot of interaction done with you and the certificate authority to make sure you are a real business and own that domain and such. Organizationally validated, there's some validation done of your business so they know who you are, where you are, and some checks, some background checks there so that it's a solid thing. Domain validated certs, which is the lowest level, are the ones you can typically buy very inexpensively with no checking of who you are, and so those are often abused. They can be bought by criminals and just used temporarily. They're just, doesn't mean they will be abused, but they are more subject to abuse because there's less validation done on them of the organization that is purchasing them. And so because of that, remember, we're looking at the top sites in each of these sectors, so the top 500 retailers, top 100 consumer sites, top 100 banks. Especially at that level, they should be using the better, higher validated level of certificates. And so that's why we strive for bonus points on EV, neutral scoring on OV, and penalty for DV.
Yeah.
Hopefully that explains.
Yeah, and the issue here, so if I want to put up a site and scrape content from a bank and try to get people to log on, what type of certificate am I going to use? I'm going to use the one that gives the padlock and shows it as a SSL configuration, but I don't want to have to validate who I am, and so that's a challenge. And so all it means is eBay with EB and 2 A's and a Y, whoever owns that domain is getting that certificate. So that's our concern in this area here. Someone else asked, how do OTA members score in the honor roll? We talked about all the other sectors and that it wasn't included in our initial breakdown. And let me go to that slide at the beginning part of the deck here. So the answer is all OTA members are scored on the criteria here. We think that's very important. And we believe that we, not only as an organization, but we as our members need to walk the talk. The good news is our members, because they're somewhat self-selected, that they embrace this concept of stewardship, score very high. And I can't remember the exact percentage, but it was close to 80% of our members last year that made the honor roll.
No, Craig, it was 96.
96, there you go. And the point is, if we Go ahead, Jeff.
Well, the year before it was 97, so we typically are up in the high 90s for our membership.
And by putting that on here, you would see all of a sudden that would skew the graph because, again, nearly twice that of the top retailers, 4 times that of the news segments. But we do track that data. We do have that available. But it really isn't about OTA. It's about the industry at large. But again, we do track our members, and we work very hard to encourage them as part of their membership agreement to adopt and embrace best practices here. Lots of great questions here, and I appreciate those areas. How do we get more information? So this deck is posted right now on the website that we shared earlier, and the webinar will be posted as well. You certainly, if you have ad hoc questions, you can certainly email OTA@admin@otalliance.org. We can provide some information there, but to be clear, we're not industry consultants. We can't troubleshoot your site as much as people have asked us there to that area. And Jeff, we have, I think, probably 1 or 2 more questions. Is on the site scanning tools, how much other information do they provide? And because I mentioned that there's a lot more behind the letter grade. Do you want to take that a little bit of some of the other telemetry that we see?
Well, it varies according to those different tools, of course, and a lot of them, as I mentioned, will, if we're talking about SSL configuration, TLS configuration, that kind of thing, even on they'll look specifically at every protocol you support, every cipher you have, and the combinations thereof, and they'll flag things that are, generally they're using a color coding like green for good and orange or, for kind of iffy and red for bad. And they'll highlight that you shouldn't be using certain protocols. Some of the older protocols actually are vulnerable, and that'll all factor into your overall letter grade, but they'll actually peel down underneath that to give you very specific recommendations on which things are causing that letter grade to be dragged down, for instance. And so for SSL Labs, which is on the screen now, they'll give you a specific readout of your certificates, your protocols, your key exchange, and your cipher strength, as well as do you support extended validation certs, kind of your certificate chain and the whole thing in there. And then some of the other sites like High Tech Bridge will look at your security configuration of your site, not just the SSL aspect of it, but the security headers and such that you use. And some of the others will go a step further and give you some indications about what else they see on your site. So they vary a bit, but all of these are publicly available, free of charge, or most of the examples we've shown here. And they can give you, many of them allow you to do a PDF report that you can then download, and it'll give you very specific areas, and whether you're complying with PCI or NIST guidelines. In the case of High Tech Bridge, they highlight that. So there's a lot of detail there, and it just takes a few minutes to run one of these, and you can see for yourself what else is included.
Yeah, actually, Jeff, I'm glad you talked about that. Let me actually just drag over real quick here. I just ran this as you were speaking here. We're looking live right now at for example, the tool that we've co-developed with Qualys here. And you see here on the screen that there's the 4 big categories of certificate and protocol. But as you go down, you can find more information. It talks about we have an issue with a HSTS header on our site. They're actually duplicate, and we know that. But as you go down, for example, here on the page, there's a lot more information. For example, extended validation certificate. We also support certificate transparency, and we have trusted. There's a new standard that's coming up, DNS CAA. Right now, we don't support it. We're not scoring against that, but there's other things as you go down in here. So I encourage you, there's a tremendous amount of data that you can find using their tools here. And also, for example, for known vulnerabilities, like for example when Heartbleed and others were coming down here, you know, we're looking here, for example, is it susceptible to Beast or Poodle? Again, how our site's being rated. So a lot of information in here, but again, that provides you, so I encourage you to spend that time in those areas. I want to, we have a moment for one last question, coming back to the trackers. And let me try to jump back to that slide that we had earlier. And a lot of confusion about this perhaps. What do we look at? So again, we inventory, and through input from other organizations, we effectively catalog what I would say benign or innocuous trackers versus those that are known to share data. So those, again, you don't lose point for trackers that are only for site analysis or fraud detection, or trackers that say that are there for operational purposes of your site, but those respective companies clearly state on their policies that they don't share data with any other third parties. So you could have a dozen of those and still get 50 points on your site for tracking, the maximum score. It's really the converse of those that are known to be the retargeting and sharing data, the ones that actually are known to be selling data. That's where we degradate, and the more you have, obviously, the more points, and it's a non-linear scale. As I mentioned, obviously, someone with 100 and some trackers last year, 130, they obviously did not make the honor roll because that put them in a negative balance on privacy. So, so that provides that feedback. And it was interesting, in a meeting last week at RSA, someone said, you know what, not only do they realize that they had some trackers of these on there, but it gave them an opportunity to renegotiate with these companies because they didn't realize that they were taking and selling their data. So it's really understand what's going on your site, and redefine the operational business purpose. And you may determine that they're legitimate and you need to have them. It may not optimize your privacy score, but you at least should have the ability to manage them and obviously revoke them when there's no longer a business need with that company. And that was this case here, that these trackers were not revoked. They didn't have a system in place or anyone monitoring that, and they found these companies were collecting and in the business of selling data. So there was two issues there. So
Craig, if I can emphasize just real quickly that some of what you just said. The way that part of the scoring works is you start with a perfect score of 50, you know, half the 100 baseline points. And the more, and I loosely call them promiscuous trackers, the more promiscuous trackers you have, your score goes down. So if you had no trackers on your site at all, of any kind, you would have a 50. The benign ones, as Craig mentioned, you would stay at 50. It's when you have those that are promiscuous, sharing with other entities, that you start to lose points. That's the structure of how we do that part of the scoring.
Well, great. Well, Jeff, it's top of the hour, and once again, for the 9th year, I appreciate your support in working through this. This is something that, you know, I'm very proud of our members really rallying together, of pulling this together. We can't do this alone, and there's dozens of companies that provide us data feeds, run APIs for us, and provide us this data. And we all share this goal of making the internet more trustworthy, improving the resiliency of our sites, and enhancing data protection practices. So I want to thank everyone, and again remind everyone that this deck and materials, including the recording, will be posted on our site later today. Thank you very much.